Well, this is a nice surprise. All of these people, there are stools around. I think we can, as long as the fire marshal doesn't get here, we'll be okay. Take the stools and place them wherever you want if you don't have a seat as of yet. There's so many new faces here. I just tell you, I'm Michael Holly. I'm the director of the research and academic program here at the Clark. And I do have one announcement. In the next, in 2 weeks from tonight, our next fellows lecture, October 16th, will be Nicola Cartwright. Are you here, Nicola? Oh, yes, okay, wave your hand. Who's going to be speaking on a new place for queens in the art and political imagination of 17th century France. But now for today's celebration, obviously the excitement of the day, and that's the return of Tom Mitchell to us. He was here as a fellow, I think 4 years ago. I always associate you with presidential elections. I remember the fellows were here and we turned on the television and we saw you back in Chicago or something. I can't remember what.
At the polling place, yes.
At the polling place, yeah. That's what it was.
My wife was getting a kiss from
the
president.
Wannabe at the time, yeah. This is really difficult, how to condense Tom's rich and very thick accomplishments to anything. I just don't know how to reduce it. But a couple years ago, I asked him what he was most proud of. He quickly replied that it was his receiving not only the College Art Association's most prestigious Charles Rufus Maury Prize for Best Book in Art History, but also just a few years ago, the Modern Language Association's, this other huge professional association, equivalent in the James Russell Lowell Prize. We don't figure, I don't figure anyway, that anyone has ever been or will be awarded these supreme accolades from both large and national disciplinary associations. Congratulations again and again and again. So really, how to condense in less than 5 minutes all the other things Tom has done and written and achieved. The merest sampling would include his, since 1978, editorship of the premier journal in the humanities and cultural criticism, Critical Inquiry, and scores of important essays and many books, just including The Politics of Interpretation, On Narrative, Iconology, Landscape and Power, Art and the Public Sphere, Picture Theory, The Last Dinosaur Book, The Life and Times of a Cultural Icon, What Do Pictures Want, Cloning Terror, Seeing Through Race, and the co-editorship of Critical Terms for Media Studies recently. Now, so many of these books have been translated into French, German, Dutch, Spanish, Swedish, Japanese, and Chinese. His many influential essays have appeared in Art in America, October, Art Bulletin, London Review of Books, Times Literary Supplement, Art Forum, Representations, Raritan Review, After Image, Salmagundi, New Literary History, 18th Century Studies, and the Chronicle of Higher Education, among many others. I don't even know that there are others. That seems to be the list. Well, I did forget Critical Inquiry, right, in which you've also published special issues on canon formation, gender, race and writing, public art, politics and poetic value, metaphor, psychoanalysis, identity politics, pluralism, new directions in art history, and questions of evidence. And so, as far as awards go, you can just imagine. They come from the Guggenheim Foundation, the NEH, the American Philosophical Society, and the Rockefeller Foundation, the Getty, as well as the Clark twice. The Clark has the distinction of twice. Tom has also been nominated, this rivals the Clark, he's been nominated for both the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. But of course he has lectured all over the world, and I really mean that, all over the world. And now he is here for his second appearance at the Clark. No doubt, Tom has proven to be one of the most vital theorists of literature, but also the history of art in our time, offering insights into the nature of the image as well as its interpretations. Such works as Iconology, The Pictorial Turn, and What Do Pictures Want have led the way to a reevaluation of our discipline's proclivities and procedures, drawing attention to the limitations of historicist and contextualist models of scholarship that tend to reduce art to history. He has always insisted on the ways in which the visual will forever elude its capture by language. Tom's interest in both the ontology of the image, the presence of the work of art, and its capacity to provoke an experiential response in the viewer, as well as the politics of the image, its role in the dissemination of ideologies. Those have been principally responsible, those ideas, for conceptualizing the project of visual culture and visual studies. So I am most thrilled, actually and very proud, to introduce Tom Mitchell, speaking this evening on Seeing Madness, Insanity, Media, and Visual Culture. Tom?
Well, thank you so much, Michael, and thank you all for coming out. I have to warn you, it's going to be downhill from that introduction. And also, I want to warn you, this lecture will be a little bit long because I am going to be showing film clips. This could be called Movies and Madness. That's one section of it. But I have to begin by saying what I've never said before, that all criticism is to some extent autobiographical. There's no way to avoid it. The myth of objectivity, of writing from some scientific perspective, especially about the arts, has always struck me as somewhat disingenuous. We write about things we care about, and part of what is involved in our work is finding out what the basis of that care is. But this lecture today is really about care of that sort, much more emphatically than anything I've ever done before. It's a preliminary report on a seminar that I taught in the winter of 2011 with a couple of colleagues, literary scholar Françoise Meltzer and her spouse, psychiatrist and psychoanalyst Bernard Rubin, with the consultation of my late colleague Miriam Hansen, one of the most brilliant film scholars of our time. But the original idea for the seminar, the motive for it, was my son, Gabriel Mitchell, who was making a documentary, a kind of combination of biopic and documentary entitled Crazy Talk, on the subject of mental illness. So the point of the seminar was to provide a historical background for Gabriel's film. We were serving as his research team to deepen our understanding of madness as an object of visual display and multimedia representation, with special focus on cinema, but also literature and the performing arts. My son had been struggling with a diagnosis of schizophrenia for 20 years. And he was in the process of transforming that struggle into a career as a visionary and experimental filmmaker. In collaboration with his sister, who is a very poor Hollywood producer, and his mother, my wife, composer Janice Miserel Mitchell, and myself as the image researcher, the goal was, as he put it, to transform his illness into a learning experience, liberating the subject of madness from its confinement within the discourse of medicine and psychiatry, and finding a way to represent schizophrenia from the inside. His aim was to humanize and demystify schizophrenia, while at the same time acknowledging that it remains an enigma that resists all the reductive explanations that have been brought to it, either as a biochemical brain disorder, a symptom of a dysfunctional social order, of demon possession, a product of confused delusional thinking, or a source of prophetic insight. All of those have been characterizations of the symptomatology we now call schizophrenia, a word that really has no definition. And if you read the DSM-4 on schizophrenia, you will quickly come to that conclusion, that there is nowhere in the DSM-4 a real definition, just a list. Michel Foucault once predicted that a day will come when we no longer know what madness was. And I think he meant by this that would happen not because there would be no more mental illness in the world, but because we will no longer be so confident about our rational scientific understanding and control of the human psyche. Because we will be capable of admitting that madness is not at the periphery of human experience, a darkness outside of enlightenment and reason that we can sequester with science or medicine or magic, but something central to all that makes us the strange creatures that we are, capable of both magnificent creativity and unspeakable acts of self-destruction. Schizophrenia, in particular, has to be understood, and this was my son's view, as an intensified form of normal mental activity, of the work of reason, memory, and imagination spinning out of control, the perfectly ordinary processes of inner vision and inner hearing exaggerated so that fantasies take on a tactile and visceral reality. Logic and systemic thinking become an uncontrollable rage for order, and the normally quiet voices of self-doubt that all of us hear become a terrible chorus of sirens, luring us to our deaths. Now, in a moment, I'm going to show you the pilot film that Gabriel made for presentation to the seminar. He was a participant in it. But first, I have to share with you the tragic news that he is no longer with us. As of June 24th of this year, he was finally driven over the edge by the destructive voices that he heard within. Voices that he had defied with the help of medication, therapy, and willpower for 20 years. Just as to all of us, it seemed he was on the verge of defeating schizophrenia once and for all. It rose up and took him away. So the film Crazy Talk is a pilot for a film that will never be made, but it provides a starting point for a film to be made, to be written and directed by his sister, Carmen, a film that we hope will go some distance toward fulfilling Gabriel's dream of conducting us safely across the threshold between madness and whatever it is we suppose that sanity and normality might be. So Crazy Talk is 10 minutes long. It's available on YouTube as well as on Gabriel's website, which is continuing to be an active website thanks to his hyper-energetic family. The website, if you're taking notes, is called filmworks.com. Film spelled with a PH, works spelled with an X. Filmworks.com. The film I'm going to show you, about 9.5 minutes in length, has music by my wife, composer Janice Mitchell.
What mental illness is in reality, and also because I think there's a lot of films that kind of misrepresent it.
forgotten that once we were brought here, we were robbed of our name, robbed of our language. We lost our religion, our culture, our God. And many of us, by the way we act, we even lost our mind.
Well, it's interesting. Cultures shape the experience of mental illness, whether you talk about depression or something like PTSD. How we think about it and how we treat it actually shapes the experience itself. So when we, as the globalizing culture in America, export our notions of mental illness in terms of how we treat it and how we think about it, we are inadvertently shaping those illnesses as well. And what we are doing by exporting our notions of mental illness around.
Oh, I'm afraid the internet connection has frozen.
Is this coming directly down from the internet?
Yeah. So let me see if I can get it to go forward.
What's your name, man?
Hey, Fred.
Nice to meet you, Randy.
Thanks for your generosity.
Oh, now you listen here. It's not the Messiah. It's a very naughty boy.
Arrogant bitch like. I'm gonna kill you, you bad guy. Are we even dirty, Deadwood? No!
Ragheads who might attack the military here in the United States. This was apparently said to Major Hassan, who it's my understanding is a convert to Islam. Is that right?
You know, there are a lot of people who have been declared crazy at one time or another who later turn out to be rather geniuses or making a contribution that people could not or would accept at the time or would not recognize, but which later turned out to be very substantial. So it's all relative. I mean, it's an easy word to throw around. I suppose I've been called crazy at times too, when people have not accepted an idea or a suggestion that I've made.
And I know that psychiatry is a pseudoscience.
Don't be so gloomy. After all, it's not that awful. Well, what the fella said. Mentally, for 30 years under the Borgias, they had warfare, terror, murder, and bloodshed, but they produced Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, and the Renaissance. In Switzerland, they had brotherly love. They had 500 years of democracy and peace. And what did that produce? The cuckoo clock. So long, Howard.
The drug will cause the subject to experience event-like paralysis, together with deep feelings of terror and helplessness. One of our early test subjects described it as being like death, a sense of stifling or drowning. And it is during this period we've found the subject will make his most rewarding associations between his catastrophic experience of environment and the violence he sees.
Didn't ask other people might die. If I did ask my brother might die.
Who is Ted Kaczynski? A genius whose mind was twisted by mental illness or a diabolical killer? Horace Sawyer takes us on a fascinating trip inside the mind of a serial killer, the Unabomber.
Implants. Those aren't your memories. They're somebody else's.
I killed Dietrichson. Me, Walter Knapp. Insurance salesman. 35 years old, unmarried, no visible scars. Until a while ago, that is. Yes, I killed him. I killed him for money. For a woman. I didn't get the money and I didn't get the woman.
This is the blonde, blue-eyed God I pray to.
The article was about the anger of the Tea Party people, and the picture on the inside was me at the age of 20, with both fists in the air. Like a middle-aged guy with
The
both
big
fists
glasses
in the
and
air.
stuff,
Yeah.
yeah, I do too.
Yeah.
Late one evening, the moon.
Sorry, that's almost the end.
And the moon was shining. We were.
I am going to not show you the end because it's just flipped over to a different thing on YouTube, a different film. So I'll be happy to talk about this film in more detail afterwards, but now I want to turn to the report on the seminar that generated this film. The first thing to say is when you give a seminar on madness, where do you start? We decided to start as close to the beginning as we could, which would be the beginning of the human species, or recorded representations of things like madness. So we started with the prophetic madness tradition in Greek literature, particularly the figure of Cassandra, legendarily the mad seer or prophetess. We went forward to the Middle Ages, to the 16th century particularly, the scenes of exorcism in 16th century Jesuit spirituality. We read a good deal of Foucault's magisterial survey of the history of madness from the Middle Ages through the Enlightenment, with special emphasis on the famous historic moment when madness was medicalized for the first time. Because up until the end of the 18th century, as you know from your Foucault, madness was simply equated with criminality, laziness, being a vagabond, homelessness, and so they were confined with everyone else. They weren't differentiated, at least not in terms of confinement. In other ways, they might have been. So the famous liberation of the insane into medical regimes in the 19th century, the photographs of Charcot, particularly focusing on hysteria, the case studies of Freud, Frantz Fanon's analysis of the psychopathology of colonialism, and the derangement of the visual field in surrealism, and finally the psychologizing of torture in Cold War fantasies of brainwashing, most famously in the great film Manchurian Candidate. Now, a central focus of the course then was on the spectacularization of madness, but we were equally concerned with the textual and even musical mediations of insanity. So we did read the DSM-4 on schizophrenia alongside Deleuze and Guattari's schizoanalysis, and listen to Joan Sutherland's performance of the mad scene in Donizetti's Lucia di Lammermoor, a scene that confirms the widespread agreement that madness, especially female madness, is not just another topic for opera, but is in some sense foundational to the medium as such. And here's a short clip about that subject.
Here's a look at mad scenes and why we love them.
Madness isn't something that just happens in operas the way it does in movies or other things. Madness is what opera is about. highest compliment you can pay a performance is that it's demented. In Italy, they have this term furore, which means a communal madness. That means everyone went crazy.
There are really three kinds of mad scenes. There's let's say, an aggressive mad scene. The music is brutal.
Sangue! Ah! Ha vinto il cielo! Dove sono? Dove i cineventi? Il paccoletto! Il paccoletto! Il paccoletto!
And then you have a kind of passive mad scene, which is a Bellini mad scene.
And we explored a similar hypothesis. That is, this hypothesis that madness is not just incidental to opera, that it's somehow central to it, that it's the thing everybody's waiting for. If it was pornography, it would be the money shot. But in opera, it's the mad scene, when the virtuoso gets to let it all out. So we were looking at a similar hypothesis with respect to cinema, asking the question, why movies about madness? Why do people want to see madness in the first place? What is the desire there? So we viewed a series of films that comprise a kind of short history of a very strange genre that we tried to refine, a genre that occupies the uncanny realm in between horror on the one hand and film noir, the detective film, on the other, between the spectacle of violent raging lunacy and the quieter scenes of detective work into the etiology of madness, or its confinement in clinical and disciplinary settings. We wanted to ask then a double question about movies and madness. First, what does cinema reveal about insanity that wasn't available to knowledge prior to its invention? And second, how does the portrayal of madness affect the specific character of cinema? Since madness has always been subject to theatrical and spectacular display, whether in sacred ritual or secular drama, what does cinema bring to it that's new or unique to the medium? I'm going to return to these questions in a moment, but first I want to state some of the fundamental hypotheses about madness that pervaded our discussions. To begin with, we felt that it's important to put pressure on the very idea that madness can be seen at all, whether in direct observation or represented in graphic and performative modes. The images of hysteria, for instance, as recorded in the photographs of Charcot, seem to participate in a feedback loop of theatrical performance, so that the hysteric provides the doctor, and often a rapt audience, with a convincing imitation of the symptoms that she knows are expected. And G.J.T. Uberman has written eloquently about this in his book on the representations of hysteria in the late 19th century. The boundary line between the facial and bodily expressions of madness and the whole repertoire of character types, physiognomies, and emotional states, as had been formulated in manuals for painters, such as Lebrun's Catalogue of the Passions, and recycled in our time in the slow motion, hyper slow motion video portraits of Bill Viola. All these are virtually indistinguishable from the image repertoire of madness. Humor theory, for instance, made it clear that madness was in some sense merely an extreme version of normal and normative facial and bodily expressions, and that there's no qualitative difference of kind between the passions understood as passing or temporary and as fixed dispositions, only a quantitative difference of duration and intensity. In other words, we all have experienced madness at some moment, and this is one reason why, certainly one motive for people being so curious about it, wanting to see it. The range of seeing madness then goes from invisibility to hypervisibility. At the one extreme, Hamlet's melancholia, which manifests itself, as he says, only in clothing, the trapping and the suits of woe, and occasionally an antic disposition that we understand as a dramatic performance, a put-on. Hamlet, he insists, has that within which passeth show, a strictly invisible condition that links him to figures like Dostoevsky's Underground Man and his direct descendant, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. At the other extreme is King Lear, whose madness is not feigned and which is hypervisible, and not only in his behavior and his bodily motions, but in the wild storms that become a fixed convention of the display of madness, right up to the film Shutter Island, where nature itself seems to collaborate in the chaotic derangement of the senses. So vision, we wanted to not quite allow to be the master term, even though the title of the seminar was Seeing Madness. If vision is the sovereign sense in the order of senses, could it be that the sovereign himself is a little bit mad? Is not the very idea of seeing, insofar as it's associated with objectivity, knowledge, reason, clarity, enlightenment, fundamentally constituted by its opposite number, the realm of darkness, obscurity, unreason, and the perverse turns of subjectivity? Could it be, for instance, that the rage for clarity in the Cartesian meditation opens onto an abyss of doubt, verging on solipsism and madness? This was the subject, of course, of the great debate between Foucault and Derrida, which left them not speaking to each other for about 25 years, because Derrida focused on the Cartesian moment in Foucault's History of Madness, much to Foucault's irritation. He said, there was only one philosopher in my whole book of 1,000 pages, and of course he has to talk about Descartes. Or could it be, as Jacques Lacan suggested, that the truth of Kantian reason and judgment is to be found, of all places, in the writings of the Marquis de Sade? Or is William Blake's figure of your reason, a kind of Kantian reason, with his insistence on one law to govern all of creation, in fact, the demiurge who brings chaos and nothingness into the world? And you don't have to rely on Blake to make that claim. You can go to Kant himself and the notion of pure reason as something which is independent of empirical reality, which creates a law unto itself. Later, I'm going to talk about the kind of occupational hazard of being a highly theoretical mathematician. Everyone knows most of the, mainly men in mathematics departments in American universities are a little bit nuts. And you would be too if you spent your days thinking about the problems they think about, which are incredibly abstract. So I hope it's evident that our approach to the topic was insistently dialectical, treating madness and its synonyms, delirium, melancholia, hysteria, folly, mania, as social political constructions aimed at confining, excluding, curing, or conquering certain forms of non-normative behavior. We started from Foucault's basic axiom that madness and insanity do not have an essential nature, but are products of knowledge-power formations, strata of statements and institutions, accessible to an archaeology of the seeable and sayable, the spectacles of madness, and the murmur of labels, descriptions, and narratives that accompany it. We assume from the outset that madness is a form of human alterity and otherness, right alongside other categories of differentiation, such as race, gender, class, and even species. In fact, the convergence of madness with these other forms of alterity and enmity may be most dramatically evidenced in the trope of animality itself, in which the mad other is regarded as bestial and subhuman, a creature of mere instincts and crude mechanical reflexes, as not in Newton, but in his companion form, Blake's Nebuchadnezzar. Another way to put this is to note that our seminar insisted on a de-psychologizing of madness, at the same time we were studying the history of psychiatry, a questioning of the claim that any discipline of the mind, from psychiatry to psychoanalysis to cognitive psychology or neuroscience, is capable of seeing madness with scientific certainty from outside. But this is not to say that we went in the opposite direction all the way. which would be to return to the anti-psychiatry movement of the 1960s and its tendency to romanticize madness, or to reduce it to a symptom of a mad society. Now, you all remember Irving Goffman, R.D. Laing, and Deleuze and Guattari, and to some extent even Foucault himself was enlisted in that cause. These seem to us that the truth, whatever the truth is about madness, it lies in some place that we have not been able to define between the biomedical and the social. And we've found ourselves, this is kind of a confession about a seminar that did not come out with a clear resolution so that we could say, now we see, now everything is clear. Most particularly when we looked at the history of professional psychiatry in America and its participation, consistent participation since the 50s in what are now called enhanced interrogation techniques, but which used to be called torture. The Professional Association of American Psychologists and Psychiatrists have only recently awakened to the fact that this actually might be something of a blot on their professional reputations. So, with all that, is a kind of the intellectual scaffolding, which, of course, as you can see, was a scaffolding that was collapsing around us as we built it. Let me move now to the movies. At the center of our inquiry was a series of films, not just about madness, but about madness in relation to its institutionalization. Martin Scorsese's Shutter Island, Anatole Litvak's The Snake Pit, Irving Rapper's Now Voyager. Many people thought this was pretty marginal because Bette Davis is not really mad, she's just sad. Depressed, and the cure is very simple. Get her away from her mother, send her on a cruise to Rio where she'll meet a charming Frenchman, and all will be well. But Now Voyager is also about another crucial thing, which is a moment in American psychiatry when Freud was being rejected, and cures of this sort, the rest cure in the country was the thing, especially if you were a millionaires. But also films like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which makes its appearance in Gabriel's film, or Ron Howard's recent Academy Award winner, A Beautiful Mind. I can tell you that Miriam Hansen forbade us to teach this film because she regarded it as such a terrible film. But as you'll see, there are reasons why a real history of madness has to take up some bad films too. Peter Brooks's Marat Sade, which revives the old tradition of theatricalizing the asylum, a tradition which actually carries on in France today. Mika Ball has recently made a film called A Long History of Madness about French psychiatric institutions where theater is a critical part of the therapy. Alfred Hitchcock's Spellbound, to me, one of the greatest examples of the genre I am trying to identify, and Sam Fuller's Shock Corridor. As this list suggests, we wanted to avoid simple horror films about madness, with their treatment of the madman or madwoman as a violent monster. So no Psycho, no The Shining. We were more interested in the point of view of the monster and in turning the cinematic gaze toward the psychiatrist, the asylum, and the whole structure of confinement and treatment that puts insanity on display. And to some extent, this reflexive turn was at the center of our consideration of movies and madness. As I said before, we wanted to ask what the movies bring to madness, what they allow us to see, and conversely, we wanted to ask what madness brings to the movies, how insanity challenges the narrative and imagistic power of this medium to represent our knowledge and our fantasies about madness. It's tempting, of course, to say that the movies allow us for the first time to see and hear madness from the inside, from its own point of view. Cinema doesn't merely stage insanity, as it did in the theatricals of the asylum at Charenton, or the vaudeville and minstrel shows of the 19th century, documented beautifully in a book by Timothy Rice about the minstrelsy and the portrayal of lunacy. Cinema inserts the spectator into the subject position of delirium, deranging the senses with an overload of bizarre sights and sounds, simulating the vertiginous world of schizophrenia with technologies of audio-visual hallucination. In the technique of the zoom and close-up, it compels the eye of the spectator to engage in an ever-closer proximity to the eye of insanity, providing an in-your-face encounter with madness that animates and intensifies the old repertoire of facial expressions of the passions, which, by the way, had all been worked out and recycled in silent movies, where the pathos formula came alive in the gestures and facial expressions. So silent movie stars, I hope you all remember this wonderful closing scene from Sunset Boulevard, retained even into the sound film the old gestures of the silence.
You see, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else. Just us. And the cameras. And those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
So insofar as cinema is nothing but a technology for producing collective hallucinations, one might say that, like opera, it finds madness central to whatever constitutes its medium specificity. Cinema's endemic scopophilia, its voyeurism and visual fetishism, has the effect of turning the phrase seeing madness into a participial construction, a madness of the visible, as well as a visual representation of madness. And I've often wondered, maybe the art historians here will reflect on Aby Warburg's madness in relation to his lust for gathering every image in the world into an atlas of everything visible made by human hands. So it was only a question of time and resources to make it possible for mad men and women to take control of the camera itself and to represent themselves cinematically, as writers and artists had already been doing for at least a century. If Foucault was correct to say that, and this is an enigmatic statement of Foucault's, one of many, says, madness is the absence of the work. That was a title of one of his chapters in the history of madness. That is, the absence of a productive capacity to create representations of itself, of its experiential world. Then perhaps cinema is precisely the medium that fills in that absence, allowing madness for the first time to work directly upon the beholder's sensorium, rather than being externalized as an object of theatrical display. Okay, well, that was a hypothesis. And we would want to qualify it considerably by noting that there were a number of pre-cinematic technologies that were already producing intense effects of proximity to madness, of inserting beholders into that subject position. Thinking particularly of technologies like the phantasmagoria, invented during the period of the French Revolutions and the theatricals at Charenton, which had already developed the art of the collective hallucination. And in contrast to movies, and in contrast even to 3D movies, as you can see, the illusions of the phantasmagoria did not appear on a screen, did not appear in front of you. They appeared over your head in vapor, water vapor or steam projections. So you can see in this phantasmagoria, there's a woman fainting on the floor, and people were duly astonished. And I can tell you, having seen one of these last year in Antwerp, it really is quite a different order, well beyond 3D. One of these days, the phantasmagoria will make a comeback in American theaters. The theatricals, for that matter, as Peter Weiss's original stage version of Marat Sade demonstrates, constantly threaten to breach the fourth wall of the screen that keeps us safe from the touch of madness, from being touched, as distinct from witnessing its sights and sounds. The virtuosic vocal expressions of passion in the opera, similarly, when coupled with the unrepeatable thrill of live performance, seem to have the capacity to touch and penetrate the soul in a way that cinema, as a recording technology, can never quite match. So we wanted to pull back from saying, oh, okay, here's this kind of progress forward, and cinema wins, it takes over from everything else. We think it's not quite that simple. We also felt it necessary to qualify severely Foucault's claim that madness is the absence of the work, because this is an absence so conspicuously overcome in 19th century literature, particularly the poetry of Hölderlin and Blake, the writings of Nietzsche, and well before the 19th century in the divine madness of poetic and prophetic inspiration, from the Greek oracles to the blind Tiresias and the hysterical Cassandra, down to the Jesuit cults of sacred folly. This is Foucault's statement on this, which, if anybody can explain this to me, make sense of it, I will be happy to hear it, because it seems so counterintuitive given everything else the history of madness directs us to. So even in the 17th century, the rituals, the public rituals of exorcism described in John Sayward's wonderful book, Perfect Fools, had already made the experience of demon possession representable and accessible to public experience. Of course, it was not a medicalized madness. It didn't have a benevolent therapeutic discourse of treatment associated with it. It had a religious discourse of salvation and release from possession. And here you see, I recommend, by the way, Sayward's wonderful book, Perfect Fools, about the exercises that the Jesuits did in order to drive themselves mad, and to turn themselves into beasts, sometimes for years, as part of doing something that God would be pleased with. So this may be another dimension of madness that cinema is uniquely suited to representing in its capacity for turning the gaze around toward the psychiatrist and the institution he represents. In other words, not just showing you the inside, letting you share the hallucinations, but showing you the institution that confines. So the films we considered all had a strong component of architecture and the social space of madness. Many of the films begin with an establishing shot of the asylum, often coupled with ominous, melodramatic music, usually reserved for the haunted house. And that's because the asylum is filled characteristically with ghosts, phantoms, and zombies, the violent patients on the one hand and the catatonic, withdrawn, lost souls on the other. The Snake Pit, I'll show you a brief clip from. This is a film that Olivia de Havilland won the Academy Award for. It treats the spaces of the asylum like the circles of hell, with the numbered wards descending vertically into the horrid vortex of delirious inmates in the 45th ward. Let me show you this quickly.
Among all those people, and at the same time I felt as if I were looking at them from someplace far away. The whole place seemed to me like a deep hole, and the people down in it like strange animals, like snakes, and I'd been thrown into it. Yes, as though I were in a snake pit.
A snake pit?
As you can see, this moment of Hollywood cinema, Freud is still the canonical father figure next to the pipe-smoking psychiatrist. Anyway, a wonderful film. I hope you'll all rush out and get it on Netflix as soon as possible. The Snake Pit also insists upon the permeable boundary between sanity and insanity in the figure of a kind nurse who becomes too close to the patients and winds up becoming one of them. Now, Voyager reverses this default mise-en-scène by delivering its protagonist, Betty Davis, from the claustrophobic confines of her Boston Brahmin townhouse to the open spaces of a rural asylum where she can rest and find her path through life as an independent, autonomous woman. So cinema allows, in other words, the world of insanity to be seen as a social world, not merely a vertiginous environment of delusion and torment, or a spectacle of monstrous, distorted faces. It traces the passages across the boundaries between sanity and insanity, and documents, most famously in Sam Fuller's Shock Corridor, but also in Cuckoo's Nest, the way that the treatment administered in an insane asylum is as likely to produce madness as to cure it. And during the anti-psychiatry movement of the 60s, this was demonstrated repeatedly, empirically, that if you took somebody perfectly healthy and committed them and just had them say, well, I keep hearing this word in my head, within 6 months, psychiatric treatment would have driven them mad. They would be responding very, very well to the treatment by becoming compliant with all of the symptomatology. So in answer to the double question, what movies bring to madness and madness brings to the movies, I think we have to say first that movies bring madness to us in a new way, plunging us into darkness in order to bring insanity into the light and make it speak. Second, that madness brings itself to the movies, commits itself to the cinema, taking up residence there as its proper home or its virtual asylum. Now I want to move to, you might think this is all pretty speculative so far, and it is, but now it's going to get really speculative. This is the crazy part. And this is very much a minority report of my own observations, tracking this amazing range of films. It might seem a minor issue in the mediation of madness, especially its visibility, and that's the question of smoke and smoking. First, on the side of cinema, we all know that it used to be possible to smoke at the movies. In the good old days, you could smoke at a lecture. The theater was quite literally a smoke-filled room, and the beam of the movie projector overhead was made visible as a cone or pyramid of light by the clouds of smoke ascending into the projector beam. There is a projector beam in this room above your head, but you don't see it. There's nothing to make it visible. Smoke thus quite literally rendered the medium itself visible, in the very literal and physical sense that the normally invisible, dark, empty space of passage between projector and screen was rendered hypervisible if one looked up and away from the images on the screen. In the film Manchurian Candidate, for instance, we get a moment of this kind when Major Marco attends a slideshow at the Defense Department of possible communist enemies staged by Army intelligence. Smoking appears, therefore, both in the cinematic illusion and outside it in the space of exhibition. And I hope you've all noticed that probably the most salient feature of the recent TV series Mad Men is, of course, smoking. It's not merely a relic, though, of a certain period in the history of cinema when smoking was permitted everywhere. It's a relic of that pre-cinematic theatrical medium that I have mentioned, namely the phantasmagoria, which used smoke and steam coupled with projection lamps to produce the illusion of phantoms and ghosts hovering in the air above the audience. But smoke in cinema, this is Marat, projected in steam. But smoke and cinema are linked not only in the genealogy of the medium, but in specific genres that emphasize the thickening of atmosphere to render vision opaque and uncertain. Probably the most obvious is the genre of film noir. Can you think of any detective film in which the hero and femme fatale do not smoke? Is not every example of this genre characterized by a figurative cloudiness in which the truth never fully discloses itself? I've already noted the overlap between the genre of noir, the dark detective film, and movies about madness, which often involve the psychoanalytic detective story, the search for clues to the original trauma. Hitchcock's Spellbound is the masterpiece of this subgenre, involving a female psychoanalyst played by Ingrid Bergman attempting to cure her amnesiac lover, played by Gregory Peck, by returning with him to the scene of a trauma and a crime that has erased his memory. In the process, Bergman not only cures her lover of his amnesia, but locates the clues that exonerate him of the charge of murder, which has triggered his guilt complex, and allows her to identify the actual murderer, who, of course, is the director of the insane asylum. Needless to say, this loving couple smokes up a storm throughout the film. But perhaps the most famous scene of smoking in cinema is the repeated ritual of Now Voyager, in which Paul Henreid lights 2 cigarettes at the same time and gives one to Betty Davis. One could allegorize this moment endlessly. At a minimum, it's an eroticized ritual that stands in for the directness of kissing, which propriety forbids, since he's married and will remain faithful to his wife. At the same time, the gesture dramatizes her passivity and his gentle aggressiveness. He doesn't give her a cigarette and offer her a light. He lights it for her and passes her the already lit cigarette, a gesture that is repeated to mysterious effect in Manchurian Candidate, when Janet Leigh observes that the emotionally distraught Frank Sinatra, who is having nightmares and panic attacks, is incapable of lighting his own cigarette. So she lights one of her own and passes it to him. But the double lighting up of Voyager exceeds sympathetic care for the emotionally distressed by the normal or sane person. It becomes a secret ritual of solidarity and partnership, one that certifies the spiritual bond between them, rendered literal as the exchange of breath. Jerry, after all, is just as depressed as Charlotte, trapped in an unhappy marriage. They can never have the moon, the full consummation of their love affair, but they can have the stars, the tiny stolen moments of incandescence launched by 2 cigarettes in one mouth. Now, I'm not going to bother you with the smoking and the Freudian analysis of it. You know Freud died from it. And the cinema of madness is riddled with pipe-smoking doctors. We know from the surrealists that sometimes a pipe is not just a pipe. A cigar is more than a smoke. We know from anthropology that smoking is a ritual of bonding and generosity, from the peace pipe to potlatch burning of tobacco, to the obligation among smokers to share the wealth, along with its unhealthy consequence. What cigarettes seem to do in movies about madness is to provide a moment of leveling and normalization across the boundary between sanity and insanity. In The Snake Pit, it's a monogram cigarette lighter that binds the deeply depressed and hallucinating Virginia Cunningham to the husband she has lost in her amnesia. In most of the classic Hollywood treatments of madness, the therapist offers the patient a smoke to calm them down. In Cuckoo's Nest, cigarettes are the fundamental currency of exchange and become the catalyst for violence when Nurse Ratched tries to hold back their circulation. In Shutter Island, which I'm going to pause on, the opening scene involves the familiar noir detective, Teddy Daniels, looking in vain for his cigarettes to calm the nausea brought on by seasickness, and being offered a smoke by his partner, Mark Ruffalo.
Yeah, fine. I just can't stomach the water. So you're my new partner. That's right. Not the best way to meet with my head halfway down the toilet. Doesn't exactly square with Teddy Daniels, the man, the legend, I'll give you that. A legend? What the hell you boys smoking over there in Portland anyway? Seattle.
Now, is there anybody here who hasn't seen Shutter Island? Okay, then I think you're going to want to plug your ears for a minute, because I'm going to give away the secret of the film. And I don't want to spoil it for anybody.
She died. Jesus, don't worry about it. There was a fire at the apartment building while I was at work. 4 people died. It was a smoke that got it, not the fire. So that's important. Sorry, folks. Oh my goddamn cigarettes. Oh yeah. 7 a month. Could have sworn they were in my jacket before I got home. Government employees will rob you blind. Thanks. Give you a briefing about the institution before you left. All I know is it's a mental hospital. For the criminally insane. Well, if it's just folks running around hearing voices and chasing after butterflies, they wouldn't need us.
And there is the establishing shot of the asylum and of Shutter Island. Okay, now's the time to plug your ears. Because what we have here is a scene of two detectives, federal marshals, on their way to Shutter Island to solve a crime, which is often the premise of the psychiatry films. A crime has taken place in the asylum. Somebody from outside has to come and solve it. What you don't know is that Teddy Daniels is actually an inmate in that asylum, and his partner, who is supposed to be a detective, is his psychiatrist. And this is a moment that will be repeated throughout the film whenever Teddy Daniels, Leonardo DiCaprio, is getting agitated. It's the cigarettes which will calm him down. It becomes his suspicion that it's the cigarettes which are causing him to hallucinate in the first place. So the detective film and the film about mental illness are totally converged in this film. And in fact, throughout the film, you are in sympathy totally with Teddy Daniels, who is a hyper-rational, skeptical detective. He doesn't believe anything people are telling him, and he's right not to believe it because they're all lying. But he is crazy as a loon. So cigarettes and smoking are more than symbolic and generic features of cinematic madness. They actually turn out to be part of the reality of the world of mental illness, from their connection with addiction and self-destructive behavior to their effects as a form of self-medication. Fuller Torrey, in his great book Surviving Schizophrenia, notes that between 80 and 90% of individuals with schizophrenia smoke cigarettes. And this is significantly higher than the 50% among psychiatric patients with other diagnoses, or the 30% rate in the general population. And these numbers, I think, have gone way down in the general population. Boredom from sitting on inpatient wards might account for this, but it also could be a kind of sedation. Nicotine reduces anxiety, improves concentration in some people, and the self-medication theory received support when a study of people with schizophrenia reported that smoking transiently improved specific brain functions. So smoking seems to provide the real, imaginary, and symbolic relay that links cinema and media more generally to the prospect of seeing madness. And why not? Since smoking is the practice that renders something like the soul visible. As you may have noticed in the earlier woodcut of exorcism, when exorcists drove the devils out of a possessed body, the beholders would often see vapors, exhalations filled with demons coming out of them. At the same time, of course, smoking reveals absolutely nothing about the distinct madness of an individual. On the contrary, it manifests the commonality of the insane and the sane as inhabiting the same world, breathing the same air, and speaking the same language. And this is perhaps the final gift that cinema brings to the project of seeing madness. When Foucault speculates that one day we'll no longer know what madness was, its form will have closed up on itself, it will no longer be intelligible. Could it be that cinema, with its smoke and mirrors, was providing the transition to a time when madness, as the archenemy of reason, normality, and enlightenment, and defined by those polarities, could no longer play that role, but is revealed as the creation of reason itself? Certainly something of this sort is suggested by the way the phenomenon of madness in the last century, aided by cinema, began to move beyond the realm of individual psychology into an exploration of forms of collective madness that were operationalized by the most cold, calculating forms of technical rationality, including the techniques of psychiatry itself. The Manchurian Candidate's diagnosis of the madness of the soldiers subjected to brainwashing is revealed finally as a political hallucination that gripped American foreign policy for the half-century of the Cold War. an era that was named with uncanny accuracy by the acronym MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. This madness then came home to roost in the insanity of the War on Terror, which projected a phantasmatic global enemy that could be anywhere and nowhere, and who, when captured, had to be subjected to the very same enhanced interrogation techniques that had been imputed to the communists during the Cold War. It's when you look at Cold War psychiatry, Cold War notions of madness, and the relation between the collective and the individual, this becomes just a kind of overwhelming in the ironies and the uncanny similarities. The madness, and this is where I will conclude with John Nash and the Beautiful Mind. John Nash's Beautiful Mind is divided on the one hand between his pathological paranoia that leads him to search compulsively for secret messages embedded by mysterious enemies in the mass media, and on the other hand, his highly productive and influential game theories that provided a mathematical rationale for neoliberal economics and the destruction of the welfare state. Both Nash's paranoia and his schizophrenia, to use Deleuze and Guattari's terminology, are riddled with hallucinations. But the game theory became an operational fantasy certified by mathematics that influenced the direction of both the Cold War strategies when Nash was working at the Rand Corporation, and later when he wins the Nobel Prize for the Nash equilibrium principle. I'll show you a little bit about that in a second. In the historical period dominated by this fantasy, the fantasy of a kind of mathematical rationality, game theory and systems theory, that would rationalize Cold War, mutually assured destruction on the one hand, and neoliberal economics on the other. This period, our own, leads me to feel that it's important to remember what madness was and how it evolved in this period into something quite close, in fact, operationalized by the highest forms of rationality. Well, there would be a lot more to say about the collective, even global madness of Cold War politics, as elaborated in movies from Manchurian Candidate to A Beautiful Mind. And I want to conclude, because of time, I'm not going to show you this wonderful clip from Manchurian Candidate, where you get to share Frank Sinatra's hallucinations. The evil Dr. Yo has put them into a state of collective hallucination where they believe that they are at a ladies' garden club waiting out a storm in New Jersey, when actually they are prisoners of the communist Chinese in North Korea. But I want to conclude with John Nash, and not with A Beautiful Mind, but with a film about The Beautiful Mind. This is Adam Curtis's film, The Trap, which has a section on the importance of John Nash for this period.
Underlying game was a dark vision of human beings who were driven only by self-interest, constantly distrustful of those around them. And there was a mathematician at the Rand Corporation who would take this dark vision much further. He set out to show stability through suspicion and self-interest, not just in the Cold War, but in the whole of human society. He was the mathematical genius, John Nash. Nash was portrayed in the Hollywood film A Beautiful Mind as a tortured hero. In reality, Nash was difficult and spiky. He was notorious at Rand for inventing a series of cruel games. The most famous he called Fuck You, Buddy, in which the only way to win was to ruthlessly betray your game partner. Nash took game theory and tried to apply it to all forms of human interaction. To do this, he made the fundamental assumption that all human behavior was exactly like that involved in the hostile, competitive world of the nuclear standoff. That human beings constantly watched and monitored each other, and to get what they wanted, they would adjust their strategies to each other. In a series of equations for which he would win the Nobel Prize, Nash showed that a system driven by suspicion and selfishness did not have to lead to chaos. he proved that there could always be a point of equilibrium in which everyone's self-interest was perfectly balanced against each other.
The equilibrium, this equilibrium which is used, is that what I do is perfectly adjusted in relation to what you are doing. And what you're doing, or what any other person is doing, is perfectly adjusted to what I'm doing or what all other people are doing. They are seeking separate optimization, just like poker players.
Is each player alone?
That's the idea, that they are alone, they're separate. Doing something that's very non-cooperative, very selfish.
Now, I'd be happy to discuss further the Hollywood film about Nash. The awarding of the Nobel Prize for a master's thesis written in the 1950s. Of course, this is the Nobel Prize for Economics, which, as everyone knows, is the most ideological of the Nobels. In fact, it's not of the same status in Scandinavia, anyway, as the Prize for Literature or Peace or Medicine or the Sciences. And the agenda, according to Nash's biographer, Sylvia Nassar, in the late 90s, was to make sure that the Nobel Prize was awarded to a theorist of economics who emphasized non-cooperative games. This was the apogee of neoliberal economics, and so they found their hero in the master's thesis he'd written at Princeton. But I want to conclude just by asking a question, which is, what form the post-cinematic media might play in the representation of madness? The answer, I suspect, lies in the emergence of things like multiple-player games, such as Second Life, which actually has a simulation of schizophrenia that duplicates many of the conventions of the horror film, complete with a voiceover that leads the player through a labyrinth toward suicide. If you want to play this game or look at it, just Google Second Life schizophrenia, and it will take you to this on YouTube. Then there's the simple invention of the video camera, which has now made it possible for the mentally ill to document their own experiences. The gaming version may be having the effect of reprivatizing madness in the solitude of the game console, but the video camera surely provides a way not only of immersing beholders in a simulation of the experience of insanity, but of giving voice and authority to the mentally ill. And some of the student projects in our seminar reflected this. Dr. Laura Howe in the medical school was doing an ethnographic experiment with the mentally ill on the south side of Chicago, giving them cheap video cameras so they could interview each other and record their experience. And my son Gabriel's Crazy Talk, consisting of a documentary involving interviews with psychiatrists, patients, the homeless, and the lay public about the question of mental illness. You saw the pilot for that film. So the future is, as always, indeterminate, but it seems to be taking us toward something like Foucault's moment when we learn not to know what madness was and finally put it to work for human emancipation. Thanks very much. Yeah. So, be happy to take questions. Yes?
For 2 years, I had the maximum security unit of the U.S. For 2 years, I had the maximum security unit of the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in my military service. I had 62 people with severe schizophrenia, the most violent mentally ill in the federal prison system. It was essentially dull. It was not interesting. These men were stereotyped. They were repetitive. Their fantasies were very, very similar. Their hallucinations were very similar. I asked them to draw the devil they hallucinated. The devil looked pretty much the same. By all of them, it was very much like a rodent-like creature. It had big teeth, it had big eyes, it may have a tail. It was not interesting art.
Mm-hmm.
There was nothing creative about it.
No.
Their emotions are flat. They have no joy, they have no pleasure. If you would be extremely bored with them at a cocktail party, they are frequently terrified by hallucinations. If you ask someone with schizophrenia, do you like having schizophrenia? Is this an interesting thing? Is this very dramatic? Do you have extra special perceptions of meaning in life and all this? Never. No one wanted to have it.
No.
My experience with the films and with the people that do not have a medical or scientific interest in schizophrenia is that there's a huge dose of exploitation. It's a kind of Roman circus abuse where you take someone who has this tragic illness and you make and you almost charge admission to go see it, as you would in Barnum and Bailey, or you would in and the whole issue of the theater industry getting involved with schizophrenia. I've talked to actors who have talked about that it really is impossible to act schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a breakdown or a fragmentation, and our need for coherence, especially when you're acting in a film, is such that we cannot imitate that. We can dramatize it, exaggerate it, but we can't actually live it as they do. And so the portrayals, I think, are very often are simply our own dramatization of what we think it may be like. Mm-hmm. So I guess I'm just putting in a pitch for the poor folks that do have schizophrenia, that there be a counter wave of let's not exploit these folks, mm-hmm. rather than let's strew our creative skills and so on, understand them better. I'm not sure we do.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the comment. I think it's really an important one, and it's a side of this story I've thought about a lot, what you might call the non-theatrical and the boring character, especially in clinical settings where people with schizophrenia are rendered homogeneous by the institution they're in. I think part of this has to do with American psychiatry and the making of the mental hospital into something that's virtually indistinguishable from a prison. It also has to do with the relation of patients and doctors in these institutions. One of my co-teachers in the seminar, Dr. Rubin, has been an administrator of several state mental hospitals in his career. And he talked at length about exactly the phenomenon you're discussing, the incredible boredom, and particularly the repetitive behavior. The two films which I think capture that most eloquently are Shock Corridor and The Snake Pit, which show the people locked into repetition. Of course, it's theatricalized for the spectator. You know, in Snake Pit, you saw the kind of the moment that everybody wants to imagine, the vortex of patients repeating the same motions over and over again. Incredibly boring for them, but turned into almost a Busby Berkeley spectacle for us. I think your comment is absolutely central. There is a tendency to romanticize and to spectacularize mental illness. But it's also true, one of my son's projects in dealing with, he had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He was hospitalized for a time. And he was medicated with a drug called Haldol. It was the first one, and the drugs are evolving. And he said to me, Haldol calmed him down because he was becoming violent and might have hurt himself or somebody else. He said, I said, is it working? Is it helping? And he says, yes, Dad, but they tell me I have a thought disorder, but the problem is I don't have any thoughts anymore. I feel like I'm living underwater in this kind of gray, dull world. He gradually emerged from that with better medications that are not like super narcotics, things like Zyprexa, which operates more directly on brain receptors. And he was not, by any means, your typical schizophrenic. A number of people here knew him and met him. He was a charming, creative, wonderful person who had gone through exactly the terrible realm, the kind of hell you're describing, and come out the other side. And he wanted to tell that story from inside. He just was getting started on it. Yes?
I wonder if you think that popular representations of mental illness like this are changing the way that actual psychiatric diagnoses are formulated in something like the new DSM?
Good question. I don't know the answer. I think the DSM is a kind of, it's a sort of self-enclosed world which is responsive to whatever is in the air as abnormality at any given time. The first DSM, right after World War II, was a little pamphlet about this big, and a significant section of it was devoted to homosexuality as something that could be cured, as a perversity that was to be overcome. Well, obviously that DSM is obsolete. Now, schizophrenia occupies a very large section of the DSM. The DSM-5 is on its way. It's always controversial. The one thing we know is that it's driven, aside from popular perceptions and movies and so forth, it's driven by two incredibly powerful industries. One is pharmacology, the pharmaceuticals, and the other is the diagnostic professions themselves. And so they converge in the DSM in terms of doing a questionnaire which can be filled out in 5 to 10 minutes to identify your symptoms according to a certain grid and then assign the right medication. So in the insurance industry, everything has to be enumerated in relation to insurance protocols. So the idea of a talking cure is, seen as obsolete, which is a terrible, terrible thing. The people with schizophrenia are often regarded, well, Freud regarded them as beyond help in the talking cure, but I think Freud was quite wrong about that. So there are many forces, popular culture, but also these forces of psychiatry, insurance, and big pharma that are impinging on this. So in order to understand the DSM, you have to look at that whole set of factors. Yes?
I was wondering about movies in which there is a slightly more humorous take, some sense that we'd all be better off if the asylums were open and the inmates came out. Things like Jack of Hearts, for example. Mm-hmm. Is that of any interest to you, or do you regard that sort of thing as somehow not worth your attention?
No, I think it's very interesting. It has a very long history. The idea of the liberation of the insane from confinement, around the French Revolution, when that became a dominant idea with Pinel and the the painting I showed of the liberation of the inmates. Yeah, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the title of it. There is a wonderful little French film about it's not Mika Ball's film, but which is in the same tradition, about the French method of trying to open the border between the mentally ill and the normal, either through theater or through just bringing people into the world. Because there's nothing like confinement to drive you crazy. Solitary confinement is torture. It will make you psychotic in a relatively short time, if you're not already. So, yes, the liberation of the insane is certainly, it's one of the threads that runs through this whole subject. On the other hand, there was a moment when that idea became so popular, so dominant, that there was that it went too far. And paradoxically, both the right and the left collaborated in it. There was the anti-psychiatry movement with R.D. Laing, where Laing said, the whole problem is these people come from dysfunctional families with, cold mothers. Mom was at fault for everything. Laing brought schizophrenic patients into small therapeutic groups. He seemed to have really good success with them. After 6 months, they were behaving normally. He treated them as equals. Then he would send them back to their families, and within weeks, they would be crazy again. Well, what conclusion do you draw from that? Well, his conclusion was, shut down the mental hospitals. They're nothing but a fraud. And Irving Goffman went along with as well, and Thomas Szasz, who just died a few weeks ago. The anti-psychiatry movement went so far as to say it is the mental hospitals that are the problem, and the nuclear family and society. Got to break those up. But this was the 60s. Then Ronald Reagan comes along and says, yeah, damn right, we want to shut down the mental hospitals. He adopted, crazily enough, the ideas of R.D. Laing to justify saying, throw them out on the street, let them become homeless. So in the 80s, the streets were flooded with homeless. And it was it's a wonderful recent book on this called Madness is Civilization, which is about the history of the anti-psychiatry movement through the Cold War. So the author's name has slipped my mind for the moment, but look at that title. It gives you the whole history of this idea of liberating the insane. It's not that simple. Closing down the mental hospitals, again, not that simple. Even though there is plenty of evidence that mental hospitals, especially the old state hospitals, were places that could produce mental illness as much as cure it. So you can see, our seminar did not leave me with some kind of absolute clear message to give you. It's an incredibly complicated picture that implicates, I think, all of us.
Time for one more question. If not, thanks very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.